And basically the objectives of the AfricaInteract project was to promote and support effective documentation and sharing of information to improve climate change adaptation policy across Africa. So we were basically tasked with 3 major undertakings. The first was to review climate change adaptation and policy pertaining to agricultural, health, and urban sectors in Southern Africa. And then the second task was to look at potential of identifying any gaps that exist in terms of climate change adaptation, research, and policy in also those 3 sectors, and the way research has informed policy making. And thirdly, which I think is quite important, is to try to identify who are the key players and stakeholders in order to look at where the opportunities that exist for mainstreaming climate change adaptation policies, to be able to explore the policy and research nexus within the 3 sectors. In terms of climate change, the negative impact of agriculture can be attributed to basically 2 direct and indirect linkages: in influence on water resources, and obviously it has also got an impact on the resilience of the key ecosystems that are required, and that has implications on productivity of food, fiber, and all other agriculture-related crops. But not only that, there are also indirect ramifications in terms of their dynamics in terms of rural and urban areas, of migration from rural to urban areas. And not only that, also the fact that there's going to be a shrinking natural resource base, and that has indirect implications in terms of increased competition for scarce resources. And what that means is that the cases of increased conflicts also among community members and so on, as they compete for scarce water resources, and as traditional social safety nets break down, more of those conflicts will arise. In terms of policies, generally the reviews found out that policies are not harmonized across ministries. So different ministries within the region are doing their own thing. There's a very strong focus on the environment, with agriculture seen as, you know, just focused on livelihood of majority of people. But there's significant scope in terms of our regional arrangements through those interministerial task forces of providing leadership at the regional level to be able to drive this change that is required at the national level. And finally, many stakeholders are not really aware about the opportunities in terms of climate change adaptation funding. You know, there's significant funding at all levels, even at the global level, for example. Countries are not actually ready in terms of climate finance readiness in order to be able to tap into those resources. So there's not good understanding of the movement in terms of where the financial resources are and how these countries can tap into those financial resources to be able to implement their adaptation strategies. The 3 key recommendations that came out from the agricultural sector review: one was establishing institutional mechanisms and technical capacity to bridge the current gaps between regional policy formulation and action planning and implementation at the national and subnational level. It speaks to the same idea that, you know, policy needs to speak directly to implementation on the ground, and effective coordination at both those levels, whether it's regional or national. And the need to develop a comprehensive national policy framework for promoting agricultural technology. There needs to be very clear policy frameworks that promote specific technology that will help us move in that direction. And also development of mechanisms to support establishment and strengthening of interactive platforms. We need more communication between the different levels, between the different communities, and so on, so that with more engagements, we'll be able to collectively identify solutions that will work at the different levels. Otherwise, operating in silos is not going to be able to provide the leadership that we require to address some of the challenges that we face. Basically, there we looked at 3 dimensions of health. That is waterborne diseases and food-related diseases and vector-borne diseases. And generally in the Southern Africa region, the burden of disease is mainly due to 4 causes, and HIV/AIDS is one of them, as one of the emerging, so to speak. And also we do have the old infectious diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, and injuries related to climate change. When we're talking about, you know, incidences related to flooding and things like that, so some of the, you know, the burden of disease attributed to those 4 main issues. But generally there is There's life expectancy has improved in the region over the years, and that has been also directly linked, I think, to the economic growth that the region has experienced, with a relative increase in per capita income in the last couple of years. So the link between climate change and human health is quite obvious, and then the question becomes, why is it that the health sector is not really integrating climate change much more aggressively than is being done at the moment? So some of the recommendations that came out of there was that we need to gather more primary data to improve the evidence base. A lot of it is speculative. There's not really actual research that has underpinned some of those policies. There's a need to do that. And also to streamline the communication of research outcomes. A lot of the work that is happening at universities and the research institutions is not really informing policy at this moment. So what are the kind of communication mechanisms that need to be put in place to be able to bridge that policy research gap? We need political support and champions, as these things, as we all know. You need someone who is out punting some of these ideas, and Dr. Sibanda explained very clearly in the morning how FANRPAN is using its platform to be able to inform policy at a global level. These things need to happen at all the various levels. Southern Africa is seen as one of the most urbanizing regions in Africa, with Malawi actually being seen as one of the fastest urbanizing regions in the world. And population growth is projected to happen mostly in the urban areas. So what that means is that the challenge in terms of adaptation in the urban sectors is even going to be much more critical, because as populations move away from the rural areas into urban centers, providing much more challenges within those centers. And therefore, policies need to be directed in trying to build resilience in these urban sectors. And an interesting thing is that, most of the poor populations who are going to be most vulnerable in these urban areas actually live in very marginal lands within the periphery of most urban centers. So they're the most vulnerable in terms of climate change challenges that strike these urban centers. As I said, the vulnerability of these communities will be worsened due to climate change, and looking at issues about water availability and quality, human health, energy crisis. All this will compound the challenges that these poor communities already face in urban centers. So some of the key findings is that need to support and enhance capacity of most vulnerable through urban adaptation activities. But very few adaptation activities are actually focused on urban areas in most of the countries that were reviewed, except South Africa, that are starting to look at adaptation in the urban sector. So there's a lot of work in terms of building resilience in our urban sectors. A lack of empirical evidence to inform policy due to inadequate capacity and available data. We just don't have enough information to try and say what kind of adaptation strategies that need to be put in place at the urban level.